Hello everyone. So today I will be talking about Sitecore and Docker. So a little disclaimer on this before I get too deep into this topic is I wouldn't consider myself as an expert. I've read the Mark Cassidy posts. I've read a few other posts out there. I've kind of monitored the Sitecore channel on Docker. And I've been able to successfully get a Docker working for Sitecore on my local machine. And I've been playing with it for probably a couple of weeks. So I feel like I'm at a point where I can start, for those that aren't using Docker with Sitecore, especially for 9.3 or 9.2, can use from my experience the steps that are needed to start working with this. One of the things I'm not going to necessarily cover in this is how to install Docker and some of the steps there. I think those are pretty well documented. Just download Docker and install it. Just make sure you're using the Windows container version, not the Linux version of it. There's a way to change that setting. I'm assuming you've done all that. This is going to talk about more about this specific repository that I currently have open on my screen, and talk about the steps that it goes through. And there's some nuances that I didn't fully understand when I first started going down this exercise of installing Sitecore Docker images, that I'm hoping that I can share with you guys. Before we get really deep into this, I just want to talk about what Docker is a little bit, and mention some of the terminology. So there's a concept of a container. A container is essentially the actual instance that you're running on your machine. So let's say you spin up a Sitecore Docker instance that is going to be running Sitecore 9.3 XP. In that case, you're going to have multiple containers that run. Basically, a container is like maybe an operating system. It's like a VM in a sense, but it's not quite the same. But it's essentially this instance of whatever the thing is. So in a Sitecore 9.3 instance, you would have to have maybe, especially in a scaled topology, you'd have to have a CD, a CM. You might have your Xconnect, your index worker, your SQL server, your Solr instances. All that would be basically spun up as different containers in your overall installation process. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. An image is just another term for the kind of blueprint for a container. So the first process that we're going to be doing with this repository is we're going to be creating the Sitecore images on your local machine. At some point in the future, I'll talk about how to get those into separate registries or repositories in Docker, either on Docker itself or in, I believe it's called Docker Hub, or within Azure. There's ways to also do this. So I'll talk about that in the future. But for today, I'm just assuming you're a local developer. You're just wanting to play with this and just get started and set up really quickly. So you're going to be creating these Sitecore images. The images would be, for instance, if you're doing a 9.3 XP instance that or overall environment you're trying to spin up, you'd have an image for your CD that's 9.3 specific. Also, before we get started, I wanted to mention that I've created a kind of a cheat sheet, which I'll link to in the description below this video. This just describes a lot of the commands that you might be running when you're trying to work with Sitecore and Docker. There's some of these are specific to just Docker, and some of these are specific to things that you might be doing. But a lot of them are very specific commands that I think are very specific to the things that you'll be doing for this video, or in the future. It goes a little bit deeper further on down that are important as you get more comfortable with Sitecore and Docker. You're going to be maybe wanting to clean data or spin up an instance and tear it down and then delete it, or delete all your images or delete all your containers, things like that. So let's go ahead and start talking about the steps to get this installed. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to clone this repository, a Git repository, onto your local machine. Another option is you could just download it if you don't want to keep it up to date. So I would advise to just clone it locally. That way, because they're constantly making changes to this. As you can see, 3 days ago, they made some changes to this. So if there's bugs, which I will note that while I was going through this process, I actually ran into quite a few bugs. So as they continually work on this repository, they'll fix bugs, and it's really a good idea to probably clone it down so you can just update it or do a pull request to pull the latest changes down. So I've actually already gone ahead and done this. So what we can do is we can jump over to my C drive, which has a folder called Docker, and inside that Docker, I've created a folder called Sitecore. Now, where you place this does not necessarily matter. Really, what you're going to do is you're going to clone that Docker Images repository. You're going to clone it somewhere. It doesn't really matter. It could be directly underneath C. It could be in the structure. I have it. The reason it's like this is that I was new to this whole process. Maybe I would have moved and put it somewhere else, knowing my knowledge that I have now. But it's up to you where you place it. So you're just going to have to pick a place to put it, and then you just put it there, and then you're just going to work from what I'm about to introduce. So this is the Git repo after I've cloned it. There's only one difference in here, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, which is how to pull specific images down that are representative of the version that you want to essentially set up, and I'll talk about that. So inside this Git hub repository, there is a Buildup PS1 file, and this is actually the file that you need to run this. Now, out of the box, you probably don't need to make any changes to this. However, you might want to specify always a Sitecore username and password. You might want to specify a registry, which I'll talk about in a later session of this. But one modification that you might want to make, it depends on your use cases, but if you want to create images, Sitecore Docker images that are specific to a version of Sitecore, and keep in mind, once you install and get 9.2 running locally on your machine, you don't have to go through the process again. So this process of using the Buildup PS1, it's just so you can build these Sitecore images on your local machine or in a kind of a private repository that's in the cloud or something like that. And once you have that repository of your images, you do not have to go back through this process again. This is just so you can spin up your images. And then once you have your images, I'll show basically the steps are you're using a Docker Compose YAML file to basically build your Docker containers. There's two paths with this. So let's say you just clone your repository down. The next thing you'd want to do is one of two things. You can either specify specific changes to this build script by specifying base tags. There's a base tags reference here, and then it's called further down in the tags section down here, these two items. So the base tags is just a way that you can specify these kind of strings with wildcards in them that allow you to just say, I want Sitecore, in this instance, I'm going to be showing Sitecore 9.2 going through this process, and then the LTSC 2019, this relates to the Windows .NET containers that you would have for identity server or some of the other prerequisites for newer versions of Sitecore. If you do not want to, let's say you want to just install everything and create just all the images all at once on your machine, you can do that. All you would need to do is not make any changes to the Buildup PS1. It would go out and create all those files in your local machine, or like I'm going to show in a future tutorial, out in a cloud repository that shows that essentially has then all the container or all the images, Docker images for all the versions of Sitecore, which is, I would say, is useful if you're doing module development, or maybe you do a lot of development for lots of different clients and they're all in different versions. What's great about this is now you no longer need to have Solr, like 5 different versions of Solr on your machine and different versions of SQL and all those other prerequisites that you previously had to do. One piece of advice, though, before we run this PS1 file, or this build PS1 file, is the first step of that process. It's going to go out to Sitecore's download location, and it's essentially going to pull down the WDP files, zips, for different versions of Sitecore that you might be wanting to install. So, for example, you might be wanting to install 9.2. it's going to download a bunch of things that it needs. But what you can do instead of doing this, because what happens in a lot of cases is these are really large files. Unfortunately, Sitecore does not have these in some sort of cloud CDN at this point, so it takes a while. I have a pretty fast connection at my house, and it takes forever to pull these down. So what I like to do is there's actually another file. If you look inside your root directory, there is a Sitecore packages.json. If you know you're going to be installing a 9.2 instance, you can just come in here and find all the things that reference 9.2 and just copy the URL, put it into your web browser, and have it download the file. And then once it's downloaded those files into a specific path, you can copy all those files and then just take them and place them in the packages location. So there's a folder where it's going to pick up all these zip files, and then it's going to use those to build your images, your Sitecore images. And there's a lot of things I've been able to download so far and I've placed in here, but I still have a lot more. That's the other caveat I'll have to say to this. So if you're running on a computer where you don't have a lot of disk space, maybe delete Solr and SQL, some of the prerequisites to some of the other things you're working on. But you really should be thinking about how you should approach this, because you're not wanting to necessarily install all these images locally. You could potentially put these somewhere else and then just change the path inside your build PS1. If you do have limitations from a disk space perspective, you can always delete these images and then go through this process again to install 9.3 if you're wanting to upgrade. And then, you have 9.3, as long as then you don't need, to go back or anything like that, you should be fine. You can also get very specific when you're naming these base tags. You can specify XC specifically, or not XC, XP specifically. So you can be very specific, so you only download the things you really need for the instance that you really need. So like I said, I'm going to assume that we need a specific version. In this, I'm going to be downloading and working on building my images for Sitecore Docker that are 9.2 specific. So once I've, specified this base tags, and this script is in the actual Docker Images Repository. There is just a mention of this down here at the bottom. So if you want to pull a similar script to just what I just referenced, what you could do is use a script like this. This script is, you could just call this, you could overwrite your build, or you could just give this a new name and just run this instead. And then this would have your tags that you specify, where you specify them right here. So this just talks a little bit more about what I basically said before. So star is going to do everything. And see, like if you specify, star, 9.1.1 and then star again, 1903, something like that. It's going to do a 9.1 with Windows 1903 for your .NET Core. And then you could specify paths here. So my script is not quite the same. It will ask me while I'm installing it. After I tell it to run build PS1, it's just going to basically ask me for my Sitecore username and passwords, which I'll talk about what those are in a second. And then, these other paths are specific to scenarios that you might have as well. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So let's go back to my script here. And so the next step is just running this. And I would not click the play button. If you've been working with PowerShell ISE, you press play here, especially when you're running this build PS1 file. It's going to throw an error saying it doesn't have a path. It's because you have to essentially run it. So what you can do is you can just come here and do a build PS1. There's no parameters I'm passing in. I could, if I wanted to, I could pass in the Sitecore username and password if I wanted to. In this case, actually, it might actually make sense to do that, because I don't really want to specify these for this course, because like I said, I've already downloaded them, so I already have them. I already have all the prerequisites, so I don't need to go out to the Sitecore repository to pull these images down. So what these are, if you are a certified Sitecore developer, you can go onto their repo where you download their software, essentially. You should be using the username and password for that. So this script basically will automatically pull these down or attempt to pull these down. But if you already have them pulled down, just like I said, just make sure they're in that packages folder, and then you don't necessarily need this step. And like I said, if you go for this step to download it, it can be very slow, no matter how fast your internet is, because it's not limited on your side, it's limited on the server side, because the server probably has a lot of requests to download files, and it's just going to run slow. So I will just click here. So I just specified a value of A, and now it's just going to go through these steps. And everything should go relatively smoothly. I haven't tried to spin up 9.2 images yet, so who knows, I might have some issues. But in theory, it should run relatively smoothly. I will note that this process, this step of the process, is going to be very time consuming. I would say probably 30 minutes or so is common, maybe even an hour of this step. Because it's building your images. Once your images are built, to spin up a container with your images takes literally only less than 5 minutes. So that's mind-blowing when you think about the previous time it would take you to set up a new environment. This is a brand new environment all the time that you can set up. So you can tear it down, bring it back up. Teardowns typically take less than 3 minutes for me, relatively quick. There's a few scenarios where I think there's something maybe wrong with my Docker instance where it hangs forever. But I'll talk about, because I'm sure that's going to come up during this. I'll just talk about how you get past that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this while this runs. All right, as we can see now, we have completed the setup steps. So what this has done is created all the images for 9.2. An easy way to see this is to do Docker ls or Docker image ls. But as you can see, essentially we have created all these 9.2 images, and there's a lot. I will say that the installation process took several hours. I would say at least 2. I don't know, I kept walking away for a while, so it's possible it took less than 2 hours. So now we have images. Now the next part is to spin up containers so that we can actually show and see our instances running. So this is actually a pretty simple next step. So all we need to do is let's first take a look at our folder structure. So we're these Docker compose files, which is what we're going to use. We're basically going to use a command to a PowerShell command or a command prompt to run this command that will essentially create the Docker containers from those images. So if we go to Windows and we go to tests, underneath tests, there's 9.3.x, but there's also 9.2.x. Underneath this is a lot of different Docker composes. So the way this will work is we'll use Docker compose, and then we'll pick the actual file that we want to use. I think what would make the most sense just for this for these purposes is to just use the XP version .yaml, and then we will run that. We'll tell it to do up, which will basically builds it up, and then we'll also look at the down command. One last thing that I haven't done yet is by running a command. So if I do, and what you're looking for, set license environment variable, and then we'll set the path to what it is in my local environment, which is license.xml. And what's great about these Docker images, if this license, I'm using my Sitecore MVP license, if my MVP license renews or will need to be renewed in about a month or a month and a half, assuming I become MVP again, then I can just replace this license file, put my Docker containers down, and then respin them back up using the new license, and then I'm back up and running with no issues. So I don't have to worry about replacing that file, although there's probably ways we could do that as well. Press enter. It's something simple as that. So now the next step is to do a Docker compose. Let's just run this in a regular Docker or a regular PowerShell window. So let's just go cd, and we'll go to Docker Sitecore Docker Images Windows Tests 9.2.x, and then I will do essentially but I will specify I will do Docker compose, and then the file I want, sorry about that, is Docker compose xp.yaml. So if we just run this, I've seen this error before. So one extra step, and I've had this problem before. So when I run the LTSC that I specified before in my base targets. So if we go back to, and I don't totally understand how this works, but yeah, so I'm missing 1809. So sometimes I've had to do this where I've had to run 1809. And so I save this change. Now it's kind of stuck. See if I can cancel. I can't cancel out. So what I'll do is I'll close this and I will open up PowerShell ISE again, run as administrator, and then I will Sitecore Docker Images. And then what I can do is I'll essentially just run that Buildup PS1 file. Make sure I saved it. Just telling it to basically do the 1809. So it's just missing an image that it's looking for. That's essentially why it's showing that error. And this time I didn't type the parameters in, so I'll just type. I ran it, didn't I? I was supposed to do that. So it's going to do that. It's going to run. And what it should find is that it needs to actually pull a few more and set up a few more Sitecore specific instances or Sitecore Docker images. So it'll spin up those images. So while that's running, I'm going to pause this. I'm going to come back. When I come back, I should be able to do that Docker compose I was just doing. And it should, in theory, start working. And then from there, that's pretty much the conclusion of the video at that point. We'll take a look at my instance. You can look in the cheat sheet that I've provided in the link below in the description. That also talks a little bit about the environments and where they're at. I'll talk in my second video on this topic. I'll talk a little bit about the Docker compose file and what kind of settings are in there. And that's when you'll see where you can understand paths and the ports that are being used, the URLs, the host names, and the ports, so that if you don't know what it is, what likely your URL is to hit. All right, so now you can see that it's completed the last of this. So this part only took roughly 10-15 minutes. Didn't take as long as the first. Nothing too major. If you were just use star and not use the base tags like I was using, you wouldn't really run into this issue. So just something to keep in mind. And so now that it has everything, so if we go back to here, you'll see that this was the error that we're getting. Essentially, at Sitecore XP Solar 9.2, the Nano Server 1809 was missing. So now that we have it, we can now go ahead and actually do this next spot. Let's just clear out that error that we were getting. And so essentially the next step is to do Docker compose just like we were before. We're going to do Docker compose on the XP, so Experience Platform, and we're just going to run this command. Now this command should take a lot less time than creating the images, and you'll know it's starting to work when you start to see this. Essentially, these are the images, and these are the actual containers that's spinning up. One issue I've had specifically on my machine, and I don't know if this is something specific to my machine or if this is something that everybody is experiencing, but sometimes some of these tasks don't get too done. They just sit there forever, and then eventually it will time out. And we'll see if that happens today with this. Oh, nope, it didn't. So maybe that's something to do with 9.3. Maybe there's something wrong there. Part of that process, it will say it's done, it set up all the things, and then there's some initialization steps it has to go through. Now, sometimes in this, I'll see some errors. If you see a lot of errors, then I've had a few situations where I've gotten, it works fine all the time, but then sometimes it just randomly doesn't seem to work correctly. I'm not exactly sure what that's to do with. So if you get those scenarios, just if you do Control-C during this process, it will start tearing down those containers that it's created, and then it will essentially have no containers. And I'll show how you can see what containers you have and what images you have. If you are not sure, you can also look at the cheat sheet that I created that's linked to, down below of the commands you run to check that. And you can check it, and then that you'll know the status of how this is running. So at the end of this, what we'll want to see is that we've already looked at the images. We have lots of images on this machine. What we want to see is a couple containers running. And once we see those containers running, as long as they're all there that we would expect to see, we can, in most situations, go to a web browser, go to the URL as well as a port number, and it should hit that Docker specific Docker container. So if you have a CD, a CM, etc., CD would have a different port than the CM environment. If you had Xconnect set up and configured, it would have its own port number, essentially hitting that specific container that you would have there. This will continually run, and so you typically want about 2 or 3 PowerShell windows open. One, so you can do other things, so you can do other queries and things like that. And then the one that's running, if you ever want to tear down your environment, just do Control-C and it will start stopping all those containers. You can press it twice and it will kind of kill or forcibly delete those containers. And once it's done, then you can run commands. You can check to see if you have any containers. You can run a Docker down if you wanted to. If you close the window without doing a Control-C, it will just continue running that container. All right, just coming back in here. So it's been running for a little bit. I wouldn't say it even made it a minute. I think it's ready for us. So what we can do, actually, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to start a new PowerShell window, run that way. We have elevated privileges to that. And we're just going to click yes, and then we're just going to go back to that folder that we were at. So CD, Docker, Sitecore, Docker Images, Windows, Tests 9.2.x. And then we can do, so the different things that we can really check the state of how this is doing. The one I showed earlier was Docker Image.ls. This would show you all the images. I think that's overkill. It's only when you're setting up all your images do you really need to know about all that stuff. The other one that's very useful is your container.ls. This will list all the containers that are running currently on your machine. So as we can see, we have quite a few already running on our machine. So I'll stretch this out. And what you can see is kind of a container ID. This is useful if you want to take interactions or do things with your Docker images or Docker containers. In the future, I'm going to show how you can run PowerShell commands inside these containers. It's a pretty simple command to do that. This also shows the images that are running, the commands that might be running inside of those, and this also shows the status of it. So they've been up for 7 minutes. That probably means I probably could have actually started seeing this and working with this pretty quickly. So from here, let's go ahead and pull this up in a web browser. So let me just pull this over, and so we should be able to access it just by going to localhost 44001, I believe. So let's just pull this down, and 4401 will be our CM instance. So, and then 4402 will be our CD instance, and so on and so forth. So that's just kind of how you can figure this out. So I'll press enter. One other thing is this is all running with HP, no SSL on this yet. Michael West just wrote something about this, but obviously there's options that you may have if you want to have these URLs require SSL. So this can take a couple minutes because obviously this is the first time this has been loaded. So we'll just go ahead and wait for this, and I'll pause it while it's doing that. All right, as you can see, it is now up and running. So one other thing I will want to show is /Sitecore. This will take us, because we're on the CM environment, or role as it's normally called, we should be able to log into Sitecore with this. So yeah, we'll log into Sitecore here and just give it a few minutes and it should load it up. So it's basically running 9.2. We can see the details of our license here, or our version of our Sitecore instance. So that concludes today's video. Like I said, really got a few more videos coming out. I've already got it slated and we'll start working on the video for how to get your solution working and publish, basically allow you to build in a solution, use Docker to compose and create containers for the version that you're trying to build against. All right, I hope everybody enjoys what I presented today. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them below. The Docker channel on Slack is probably a great place to go for any questions that you may have. And I will leave some links down below that can be helpful for you as you explore this topic. All right, thank you.